Well, thanks again to Colin. I really found this presentation extremely fascinating, and I think and hope that our interpretation will complement each other. And I'm sure there is also a certain contradiction, at least implied, because we're not interpreting the same film. And the second thing I'd like to say before I start is that I was planning to say a few words about Tarkovsky's hermeneutics and so on, but then I realized that there isn't time enough if one only has 30 minutes. So maybe we can discuss these questions afterwards. I'm sure Colin has a lot to contribute as well. So how can we interpret Tarkovsky's films correctly, whatever that means? Okay, I'll have a PowerPoint presentation as well, so just give me a sec. Can you all see this? Roswan, can you see it? Yeah? Can you see the PowerPoint presentation?
Yes, everything seems to be fine there, Christoph.
Okay, then I'll start. Okay, Sacramental Science and Conjugal Love in Tarkovsky's Solaris. So first, I will say a few words about sacramental science, and then in the second part, I'll turn to conjugal love. Today, numerous scientists, having spent many hours in the lab, gather in committees to reflect on the ethical implications of their work. The relationship of science and ethics has become one of the most discussed topics of our time. Be it the nuclear threat, climate change, or artificial intelligence, we have all been sensitized over the last decades to the vast and incalculable consequences that the ruthless manipulation and exploitation of our planet has for the future of humankind. However, it seems to me that the dichotomy between the sciences and the humanities that has haunted the Western world for many centuries has by no means been overcome. Ethical evaluation is always meta-reflection. There may be a consensus among scientists about a particular scientific question, while they at the same time completely disagree regarding the ethical evaluation of the problem. While the scientific theory is believed to be empirically verified, or at least verifiable, or perhaps falsifiable, ethical judgment is viewed as lacking such objectivity. Chris Kelvin, the film's main protagonist, remarks before his trip to the space station that it is only the human being that makes science either moral or immoral. In his view, science as such is ethically neutral, and moral judgments are merely human interpretations that are imposed on nature rather than derived from nature. There is no question that the opposition between science on the one hand and morality and humanity on the other plays an important role in Tarkovsky's Solaris. The contrast between the contemplative beauty and stillness of nature and the sterility and ugliness of the space station orbiting the ocean-covered planet Solaris is artistically and visually striking and creates an enormous tension in the film. So that's a scene before his trip. This is close to his father's dacha, and that's at the space station. There are also many dialogues that discuss the relationship between science and morality. However, as I will try to show, in Solaris, the opposition between the allegedly inhuman and godless sciences and the humanistic and theological quest for moral and spiritual integrity and truth is precisely overcome. Ethics, morality, and spirituality are precisely not regarded as optional and subjective meta-perspectives on scientific problems. In the film, Chris Kelvin's task is to find out whether the exploration of the planet Solaris still makes sense, or whether it would be advisable to cancel the project. Moreover, the purpose of his trip to the space station is to investigate strange and unexplainable occurrences. The crew once consisted of 85 scientists and cosmonauts, that was then reduced to only 3. For about 2 decades, scientists involved in this research project were unable to answer conclusively the question of whether the exploration of Solaris had produced any tangible results. The main reason for this impasse was the fact that they could not agree on what can be considered a result and what not. In a video recording of a hearing that is shown in the film, leading scholars share their views on the Solaris project. It turns out to be a discussion about the limits of knowledge and about how far the expedition is able to expand the horizon of human knowledge. One of the professors argues that the project has failed. What we know about Solaris is like a mountain of disparate facts, which cannot be squeezed into a conceptual framework. At first glance, there doesn't seem to be anything unusual about this statement. If the framework within which scientific experiments are carried out loses its explanatory power, scientists refine it or replace it by another one. We then have to do with a scientific paradigm change. However, what the scientific community experiences in Solaris goes far beyond challenges of this kind. It is not just the validity of a hitherto convincing scientific theory is questioned on the basis of new research data. Rather, the object of scientific investigation itself, Solaris, the planet or the ocean, starts to generate new and completely unexpected questions. And these new questions no longer have a narrowly scientific character, but radically transgress the boundary between the sciences and the humanities, and ultimately lead to theology and metaphysics. Put differently, it is now the ocean-covered planet that addresses the scientists. The planet Solaris is no longer the object of examination, but turns into an active subject that morally and spiritually challenges the people that have dared to approach it. There is no longer a clearly delineated scientific realm within which experiments can be carried out that are ethically and spiritually neutral. Ethical and spiritual considerations cannot be reduced anymore to meta-reflection on scientific experimentation and procedures. Rather, the scientific and the spiritual realm are inseparably intertwined. In Solaris, we find to some extent the idea of the pre-modern Christian cosmos, that is, everything created participates in God. Every investigation of nature, organic or inorganic, brings us mysteriously into contact with the divine, for the Spirit of truth is everywhere present and filleth all things, as Orthodox Christians pray every day. It goes without saying that Tarkovsky's artistic visualization of these ideas makes it impossible to identify a theologically convincing notion of God in this film. But as we know from Tarkovsky's diaries, even the Soviet censors realized that this was not just a film about morality and human conscience. They explicitly asked him to cut out the concept of God and the concept of Christianity. But in what way does the planet Solaris morally and spiritually test the crew members? After his arrival on the space station, Chris Kelvin learns that the mysterious ocean responds to the scientists' bombardment with X-rays by giving material form to repressed memories, which evoke feelings of guilt, remorse, and shame. The scientists have no choice but to face their regenerated visitors that appear on the space station, people they have wronged or mistreated in the past. We actually don't learn much about most of the people, with the exception of Chris himself. So Chris is visited by his former wife, Hari, who committed suicide 10 years ago out of desperation. She thought that Chris did not love her anymore. I think it is not too far-fetched to see in Chris's trip to the space station a kind of science fiction desert experience, an exodus in the biblical sense that opens up the possibility of maturation and spiritual growth. It is precisely the dehumanized setting of the space station that serves as the condition of possibility of Chris's spiritual growth. He's confronted with some dark aspects of his past life and rediscovers the mystery of love, remorse, forgiveness, and repentance. What is remarkable is the anti-Gnostic character of Chris's journey to the planet Solaris and back to Earth. Mother Earth, human civilization and culture, the natural habitat of human beings, is and remains the place where the good life is realized, insofar as it can be realized at all. The temporary estrangement from the human world that Chris experiences on the space station is no mystical escapism from this environment and his family relationships. The return to his father's dacha, the Russian country house, is a crucial aspect of the narrative. The dacha and the pond in front of it. As a number of commentators have pointed out, it is not even clear whether Chris's trip had actually taken place in space and time. For instance, the fire that he lit to burn some of his old stuff before his departure is still smoldering after his return. Most importantly, the very last shot shows his father's dacha on an island surrounded by the Solaris Ocean. The dacha and the mysterious ocean no longer belong to different worlds, but coexist side by side, at least for those like Chris Kelvin who have the eyes to see. Moreover, after his return, Chris looks through the window of the dacha and sees his father in the living room sorting out some books while the rain is pouring down on him inside the living room. So the rain is pouring down on the father inside the house. Although the father doesn't seem to be aware of this. Once again, it appears that Chris is only now able to recognize certain subtle aspects of reality that he hitherto ignored because of his positivistic outlook on the world. So that's the scene when he returns to the dacha and he sees the father inside. This reminds me of Markel, the older brother of elder Zosima in Dostoevsky's The Brother Karamazov, who shortly before his death and after a radical conversion explains to his family that, quote, "We are all in paradise, but we don't want to know it. And if we did want to know it, tomorrow there would be paradise the world over." In Tarkovsky's later films, I think this incarnational and anti-Gnostic view of the relationship between nature and the supernatural is to some extent lost. I mean, that's really highly speculative, so we can discuss it afterwards. I'm not insisting on the correctness of this invitation. Particularly in The Sacrifice, his last film shot in Sweden, it is no longer clear whether the good can actually be realized and embodied in this world. Alexander, a retired actor, averts a nuclear catastrophe by annihilating his earthly existence. That is to say, he sets his own house on fire. So we see here an important difference between Solaris and The Sacrifice. In Solaris, Chris, after his spiritual purification, returns to his father's dacha, to his earthly home. Once again, the events on the space station do not ultimately alienate him from his creaturely embeddedness and from historically and culturally conditioned human existence on Earth. Rather, the space trip repositions him within his original context. He returns to his father's dacha because the truth and goodness he was granted to experience can and must be realized here and now. So again, in the sacrifice, the house is destroyed, the home is destroyed at the end of the film. And here, it's different. In Solaris, Chris recognizes that grace indwells his paternal dacha. So that's in a nutshell my interpretation. In the sacrifice, we find a much more pessimistic eschatology. Alexander's atoning intervention completely isolates him from his family, and as already mentioned, leads to the complete destruction of his human existence on Earth. At least from the perspective of the spiritually blind world, he has succumbed to madness. The superficiality, emotional coldness, and rivalry among his family members is depicted as virtually unredeemable. The ending of the film implies that Alexander may spend the rest of his life in a mental health clinic, or at least for a long time. Nostalgia, too, ends with the self-immolation of the Italian mystic Domenico. Perhaps one could even go so far as to say that while in Tarkovsky's earlier films, purification and transfiguration are among the main themes, in his later, more pessimistic, and perhaps also more Gnostic films, self-annihilation is regarded as the only way to cope with the fallenness of the world. Although one has to add that, of course, these self-sacrifices still bring about a good in the world. That's very important to keep in mind. Now let's return to Solaris. To be sure, there is no happy ending in Solaris either. Chris remains a tortured man, and even after his return, he completely lacks the joy and serenity of a saintly person. He has only caught a glimpse of a new life, and particularly the ending of the film creates an intense eschatological suspense that is generally characteristic of Tarkovsky's films. Any realized eschatology is completely foreign to Tarkovsky. Human life takes place in between a dark past littered with traumatic experiences, failure, betrayal, and lovelessness, and a future that remains, even if there is hope to some extent, apophatic, unknowable, and mysterious. Now I turn to second part, conjugal love. Chris's initial reaction to the unexpected appearance of his former wife Hari on the space station is a feeling of terror and deep-seated shame and guilt that he seeks to overcome by getting rid of her as quickly as possible. So that's a screenshot. You see the terror in his face after Hari's first appearance. He locks Hari up in a shuttle missile, launches it into space, and thus hopes to regain his mental equilibrium. However, the ocean regenerates Hari, and she reappears shortly afterwards in Chris's room. A great deal of the film revolves around the question of Hari's identity. Dr. Sartorius, so one of the remaining crew members, who maintains a radically scientific position, advises Chris to completely ignore her. He argues that Hari is not real, but only an assembly of neutrinos, only an artificial copy of the original Hari who died a long time ago. That's Sartorius and Hari. A second view, which is not explicitly held by any character in the film, but which is very popular among commentators, interprets Chris' struggle exclusively in psychological terms. Even Tarkovsky himself explains that, quote, in simple terms, the story of Harry's relationship with Kelvin is the story of the relationship between man and his own conscience, end of quote. This is certainly true, but does not mean that Harry's appearance can be reduced to repressed psychical content that emerges from Chris's unconscious. Some commentators go even further and argue that, quote, Chris falls in love with an ideal replica of his own making, and that he imagines and makes Harry the wife made of neutrinos, end of quote. In other words, the relationship between the real historical Harry and the new imagined Harry is minimized to such an extent that Chris's experience amounts to mere solipsism. There is some partial truth to this view, which I will discuss below. However, generally speaking, scientific, positivistic, or merely psychological interpretations are, in my view, implausible and hardly do justice to Tarkovsky's intellectual and artistic universe. I propose a theological understanding of Solaris that regards Harry's eschatological identity as the foundation of her appearances on the space station. Chris Kelvin himself questions a scientific view of his wife when he introduces Harry to the other two scientists. When Sartorius advises him to perform an autopsy on her to understand that she's not real, but only a materialization of the person Chris once knew, Chris answers, this is my wife. It would be like sawing off my own leg. Chris' statement clearly implies that he and his wife are one body. So there's a biblical reference, obviously. In the dialogue between Sartorius and Chris Kelvin, two worldviews collide. Even if Chris himself is only a recent convert whose understanding of reality has fundamentally changed after his arrival on the space station. There are also reasons to reject a merely psychological reading of Solaris. First and foremost, Harry is a person all three scientists are able to meet, unlike Chris's mother, for instance, who only appears in one of Chris's dreams and therefore is not real in the same way as Harry. Secondly, the physical dimension of Harry's appearance is extremely important for the correct understanding of the film. We also shouldn't forget that Chris and Harry spend most of the time together in bed. I mean, that's a fact in the film. Thirdly, Harry's behavior and character undergo a considerable transformation during her stay on the space station. She's by no means only Chris's projection, an ideal replica of his own making, but rather an independent agent whose actions are utterly unpredictable, or at least she becomes an independent agent throughout the film. The point is not that the scientific and psychological aspects of her appearance are irrelevant. After all, Solaris is a science fiction film. Scientifically, Harry is an assembly of neutrinos, and psychologically, she does emerge from Chris's memory. But most importantly, she's also real, that is to say, she is the eschatological Harry. The relationship between her and Chris on the space station is therefore best interpreted as an eschatological anticipation of a fully realized and perfectly harmonious conjugal love. This is expressed in one of the film's most beautiful scenes, where the couple is levitating in the library of the space station. Here too, the science fiction element is closely intertwined with the psychological, spiritual, and eschatological. From a physical perspective, there are 30 seconds of weightlessness on the space station, a phenomenon that can be explained scientifically as the temporary suspension of gravity. During this time, Harry and Chris tenderly embrace and start to levitate, while objects are floating through the air that remind them of their earthly home. For instance, there's a book, it's Cervantes' Don Quixote, and candelabra, and so on. We also see the paintings Hunters in the Snow by the Dutch painter, 16th century painter, Peter Bruegel. And most importantly, we hear Johann Sebastian Bach's choral prelude in F minor, slightly modified by Eduard Artinieff. So there's much time to watch clips, but I thought that we can't miss this particular clip because it's probably constitutes, in a way, the very center of this film. So it's all about 2 minutes. Please make sure that you can hear the music. It's very important because the Bach prelude is a very essential aspect of the film. It's a very beautiful piece of music, and it's really not possible to articulate what it actually conveys, but it's extremely important for the film. So here's the clip. Okay, that of course was the Solaris ocean at the end. After this ephemeral moment of harmony, peace, and love, Harry commits suicide by drinking liquid oxygen, but is instantly resurrected by the Solaris ocean. The couple's tender embrace was indeed only an anticipation of a state of pure reciprocal love. Sadly, Harry's suicidal tendencies still prevail on the space station. One could thus raise the question whether the levitation scene should not rather be seen as a moment of sentimental delusion that doesn't have a transformative effect on the relationship of the couple. It is once again the great master himself, Tarkovsky, who seems to interpret his film along these lines. In his view, Kelvin simply repeats the mistakes he has made on Earth. Quote, their relationship ends as it did on Earth, end of quote. However, I'm convinced that the film is much more complex and that it allows for a different interpretation. So I'm here actually contradicting Tarkovsky, and I think that he invites us to do precisely that. But again, we can't talk about these hermeneutical questions now, maybe afterwards. I think there is evidence that both Chris and Harry undergo a significant transformation throughout the film. I have already mentioned that after Harry's first appearance on the space station, Chris is overwhelmed by a wave of guilt and shame and seeks to get rid of his disturbing visitor as quickly as possible. The second time she is regenerated, however, Hari appears again, like the first time, against the background of one of the space station's round windows. But this time she's bathed in a golden glow, leaving no doubt as to where she's coming from. Yes, it's almost like an angelic creature, if you like. This time, Chris's reaction is quite different and more welcoming, for the way he perceives her presence has changed. A merely psychological interpretation fails to recognize the metaphysical and eschatological dimension of Solaris. Chris learns, after his wife's second appearance, that the bond of love that connects him with Hari could neither be severed by his past failure and betrayal, nor by Hari's suicide 10 years ago. So here I'm talking about the first suicide. Having experienced the destructive and debilitating force of guilt, Chris rediscovers another, more precious reality, namely love. He realizes on the space station that he loves her, and Hari becomes aware that she is loved. So there is a deliberate asymmetry in this statement. I will explain why I think it's important. To be sure, the couple only catches a glimpse of the beauty and eternal character of love. Both Chris and Hari still remain caught in their broken selves and neurotic patterns of behavior. A psychological analysis of the relationship can be illuminating so long as we don't succumb to a psychological reductionism. Chris's behavior is that of an obsessive personality whose love of the other is tainted by objectification and who refuses to recognize the other's existence. The obsessive hates being dependent on the other and maintains a phantasmatic relationship with the cause of his desire. The partner thus tends to be instrumentalized and becomes exchangeable for any other. As Bruce Fink explains, the obsessive, quote, is led to annihilate any actional partner to ensure that he retains his independence from any specific person. And Fink continues, instead, the human partner is often transformed in his mind into a mother figure, a provider of maternal love and proper object of filial devotion. End of quote. Both the annihilation of Hari as well as the fusion of Hari with Chris's mother play an important role in Solaris. There is a scene where Chris has a dream, and in this dream, his mother and Hari appear, and they look almost exactly the same. So they fuse to some extent. Now let me turn to Hari. Hari's behavior is hysterical. The hysteric, which according to Freud and Lacan is normally a woman, seeks to be the object that makes the other desire and perceives the other a lacking being that she wishes to complete. However, in order to safeguard her permanent role as the other's object of desire, she arranges things in such a way that the other's desire remains unsatisfied. In other words, the hysteric is dependent on the other insofar as she compulsively attempts to make the other dependent on her. Indeed, one of Hari's first questions is, do you love me? Or, what's the matter with me, Chris? So these are typical questions raised by hysterical personalities. And after her first suicide on the space station, she asks him not to touch her and wants to know whether Chris finds her repulsive. Without being assured of Chris's presence, erotic interest, and attention, Hari's identity dissolves, depicted in the film as self-annihilation and suicide. However, and this is often overlooked by commentators, the couple's neurotic patterns of behavior do change, although not completely. At the end of the film, Chris wants to live with Kari on the space station, even if this is, of course, not possible. He discovers his love for her that, eschatologically speaking, has never ceased to exist. He recognizes her as a unique and irreplaceable person. Kari is no longer a phantasmatic projection of his own making. On the other hand, Chris, until the end, remains uncertain as to whether he has overcome his old self. When Snout suggests sending an encephalogram to the planet with Chris's brain activity, Chris hesitates because he thinks that his unconscious may still wish for Kari to disappear. Kari's development and spiritual maturation manifests itself by her becoming more and more independent of Chris. She gradually assumes an identity of her own. The scientific and psychological spiritual aspects are again closely interconnected. On the one hand, she gains independence in the sense that Kari qua neutrino assembly becomes more and more human and incarnate. On the other hand, as outlined above, this transformation is also a partial overcoming of a self-destructive hysterical behavior. Yet, Kari's positive development too is marred by various backlashes and repeated self-destructive fits. Her final destruction through Sartorius' annihilator, that's a device one of the scientists builds on the space station. Her final destruction through this annihilator, however, is perhaps qualitatively different from her former suicides committed out of desperation. I think that the last disappearance is based on an intentional decision made by a free agent as self-sacrifice that becomes inevitable, for a perfect reunion and loving relationship with Chris is not possible on the space station. Once again, although she is the real Kari, understood in the eschatological sense, her appearance on the station and her partial reconciliation with Chris is only an anticipation of the time when everything will be made new. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christoph. And according to tradition, Colin will give a response to Christoph's presentation, and then we'll have some questions from the audience.
Thank you, Razvan, for the opportunity to respond, and thank you, Christoph, very much indeed for a really fascinating response to Solaris, a brilliant paper that's raised an enormous number of questions for me, and I want to leave room for everybody else to pitch in if they want to. I think overriding everything in my mind, as I say, there are a number of questions, is this thought, this kind of hermeneutical question. I think you quoted, Christoph, near the beginning of your paper, a line from Chris himself at the beginning of the film, and correct me if I'm wrong, or near the beginning of the film, before embarking for the space station, where Chris talks about being squeezed into a conceptual framework. Is that Chris's line? Yeah. Okay. What fascinates me about that and your paper is that, in a sense, Tarkovsky, through Chris's journey in Solaris, determines to completely avoid the possibility of squeezing his work into anything like a conceptual framework, or a hermeneutical framework, if you like. And I think that rings bells with Rowland's question at the end of my talk about Stalker. Does this film not resolve, does Stalker not resolve in the speech of the wife about her husband? In a sense, yes, but then Tarkovsky twists, as it were, out of our conceptual or hermeneutical grasp. One of the great hermeneutical frameworks that Tarkovsky seems to rail against in Solaris is science fiction itself. Science fiction is, of course, a notoriously rigid hermeneutical framework, as is evidenced perfectly by Stanislaw Lem's disappointment in Tarkovsky's film of his novel. So Stanislaw Lem famously thought that Tarkovsky's film was not up to much. And I think that was because, and I haven't got the quote to hand, but Stanislaw Lem, I think, really was disappointed in the fact that the film was not a straightforward science fiction film. And of course, it isn't. Science fiction is defined, and I've always been quite fascinated by this definition of science fiction from J.G. Ballard, who knew what he was talking about, who talks of science fiction as being some kind of metaphysical and philosophical framework around man's place in the universe. I don't think Tarkovsky might say up to a point, because as you've highlighted, Christoph, in that paper, any realized eschatology or any firm grasp we might have on what the film is intending to say is consistently undermined. And I'd like to hear more of your thoughts on that subject. Because I think even so that's science fiction, but science itself is viewed, as you correctly point out in the film, I think correctly anyway, is viewed with some suspicion. So when this struck me yesterday when I watched the film again before this evening's discussion, when Harry resurrects, as it were, having drunk the liquid nitrogen, Chris says to her, "You are dearer to me than all the scientific truths which have ever existed in this world." The closed world of science, or even the closed world of the humanities, seems to me to be what Tarkovsky is intending to do by constantly bombarding or crashing into each other Solaris and Earth. Solaris seems, as you interestingly say in your paper, it undermines the scientistic approach of humanity by throwing the humanities in its path, or throwing psychology, or throwing our emotions into the path and the trajectory of the film's diegesis, which I think is absolutely exactly right. So if you want to talk about hermeneutics, Christoph, do please go ahead. I just want to say thank you very much for that fantastic paper. I want to, perhaps we could end, I think this is a really interesting, and apropos your paper and how I'm feeling about it. This is a quote from Skakov, Nariman Skakov, his interpretation of Solaris, which is pretty good, I think. But it goes beyond Solaris. I think this is true for all of Tarkovsky's work. He says, "The conclusion seems to be that only art, and by extension imagination and even hallucination, are able to resolve the conflict between the present reality of Solaris and the distant memory of Earth. For Tarkovsky, truth," and this is really important, I think, "for Tarkovsky, truth lies beyond the rigid boundaries of scientific discourse and is situated in the artistic (brackets artificial) realm." How would you respond to that, Christoph, that quote from Skakov, in relation to your thinking in the paper?
Yes, let me start with hermeneutics and then turn to this question. First and foremost, my invitation, I'm not particularly interested in authorial intention, because I'm very interested in what Tarkovsky has to say about his films, but he's not necessarily the best interpreter of his own films. I think that's a a common insight that artists, even great artists, sometimes say banal things about, you know, amazing works of art. So I'm not saying Tarkovsky doesn't have anything interesting to say, but I think the work of art is much bigger. So as far as Tarkovsky's hermeneutics is concerned, I think, first of all, he has an aristocratic understanding of the artist.
Interesting.
So the artist
Yeah.
is a prophetic figure, a seer, perhaps even a spiritual guide himself or herself. In most cases, the artist is a man, because he belongs to this kind of Russian tradition, so it's a mixture of Russian Orthodoxy and Romanticism. So the artist has a specific calling, so he's different from anyone else. So that's the first aspect. He has something to say that other people couldn't say. At the same time, it's very important for Tarkovsky that the people who watch his films have to do the interpretation. They have to decode it to some extent. He says they're on the same level as the artist. So it's a paradox. On the one hand, the aristocratic understanding. On the other hand, the viewer has a big task of interpreting the film. And therefore, I think it's legitimate even to contradict Tarkovsky's own interpretation. But, and that's very, very important, any interpretation is, of course, subordinated to the film. So that the film, as a great work of art, allows for, you know, thousands of different interpretations. And 5 minutes after interpretation, we have to move on, yeah, and interpret it differently. So that's I think the main insight.
Thanks for that, Christoph. I just want to, in light of that, I totally agree with you about Tarkovsky's attitude to the artist. This is a quote from Sculpting in Time. He says, "The artist seeks to destroy the stability by which society lives." And I think that would include hermeneutical frameworks of all sorts. So the artist's role is destructive for the sake of drawing closer to the ideal. Society seeks stability, the artist infinity. So if that's what you mean by aristocratic, I entirely agree with you that's clearly, you know, he's a self-confessed aristocrat in terms of his approach to the arts. Yeah.
There's a mythological element.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But, you know, in my interpretation, I'm trying to harmonize, you know, the dichotomy between science and humanities. And that's maybe counterintuitive when you watch the film. But I think it's actually more convincing. And I think it's a possible interpretation, because when you watch the film, the humanistic and theological is always mediated by the scientific. You see, so Hari is introduced to the scientists. Okay, Sartori says she's only a neutrino assembly. But they still talk about this particular person. They can all see her. And Chris even takes the blood sample and comes to the same conclusion. He says, yes, she's only a neutrino assembly, or only, but at the same time, she's my wife. So in a way, you know, the scientific and the humanistic or theological are not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, the danger, I suppose, that Tarkovsky, without using the word, that Chris and Sartorius represents a sort of scientific reductionism that Chris won't succumb to, which in itself is a way of deconstructing the frameworks that that we all find ourselves living in and among, which is fascinating. Sorry, Christoph, I interrupted.
No, that's fine. Just continue.
But before throwing it open to everybody, I don't know how long I've got, Razvan, but the other thing that fascinated me in your paper was almost an incidental remark about the importance of home in Tarkovsky's films. And I don't think that had quite occurred to me before. And it's obviously there in Stalker, which is fresh in our minds, but you're absolutely right. It's there in Sacrifice. It's obviously there in Mirror. Perhaps less, I'm casting my mind back now, but less in Andrei Rublev. But home is a very important thing, and a very important theme in the films. And it suggests to me that this is again a hermeneutical framework, I suppose, or a philosophical framework, but there's something, it always strikes me that there's something very Neoplatonic in Tarkovsky's worldview or in his religious outlook. So there's always, obviously in Stalker, but just as much in Solaris, a procession from home or from the stability or from the cause, from a safe place out into a dangerous world, only to be able to effect a return, but changed. So there's an endless cycle, a Neoplatonic cycle of procession and return in Tarkovsky's thinking. Whether it, you know, how explicitly he would absorbed that through Christian faith, through Orthodoxy, I have no idea. But it seems to me to underpin a great deal of Tarkovsky's worldview, a kind of a procession and return in a Neoplatonic sense, that you must go out in order to return. Often it's a very powerful narrative device too. It lends itself perfectly to that. Razvan, that's my response, and I'd love to be able to throw open the floor to anyone who else might want to ask a question of Christoph.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you, Christoph, as well. As I said before, participants can raise the hand. They can find this function if they click on the tab participants and then select at the bottom the little button, the little icon that says raise hand. Or if they cannot find that, they can write something in the chat through text. Well, in any way, shape or form, here's your chance to ask questions. Oh,
Rowland.
Rowland.
Oh, you have to unmute yourself, please. Oh, I can do it.
Okay.
Yep.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you, Rowland.
Yes, thanks again for your very interesting presentation. I mean, there's so much I could say, but I perhaps just confine myself to a fairly simple question, actually. A lot of critics seem to, well, in the Stanislav Lem novel, it's absolutely clear that Chris does not return to Earth. He remains on the space station, hoping that the time of cruel miracles is not past and that yet another incarnation of Hari will appear. And this is obviously, you know, a foolish thing to do in a sense. You know, it's a kind of hanging on to a kind of illusion, but still unable to let go of it. But in the film, I mean, I have to say that I think he does actually return to Earth, although people I've discussed the film with seem to deny that quite often and say, no, he's still there on the space station and the ocean has simply recreated his home and his father for him as part of its, you know, what it can do. You know, it can actually recreate stuff from his mind. I mean, to me, in all sorts of ways, it makes much more sense if he does actually return to Earth at the end. And what do you think about that?
Thank you. Yes, no, I think in my interpretation, the return is actually really important. That's what I call the anti-Gnostic dimension, you know. So these Exodus motives, so he is leaving his home, then he returns, he's transformed on the space station. But the way he's changed, it's not escapism, a mystical escapism from the real world. But what is being transformed is precisely, first of all, the relationship with Hari, of course, but she is not a normal human person, but also the relationship with his father, you know, that's very important. And so to argue that he never returned, I think it doesn't make sense because, you know, he returns to the dacha, there's the prodigal son scene, and the rain inside the house. So it's very important. So I think it's much more convincing to argue that he has new eyes to see, something he didn't see before. But it's still his home and his habitat, you know, his human life in space and time. So I think it's very important that he does return.
Yeah, I think that ethically, obviously he was haunted by guilt over his wife's death, and you know, these reappearances on the space station have basically changed him. And now the way to move forward from that is not to remain fixated on the dead, but to actually repair the relationships with the living. his relationship with his father was not as good as it should have been, but he's learned from the encounters with the, if you like, the ghost of Harley to actually really create a better relationship with his father, and that's, to me, that makes ethical sense.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's extremely convincing. Yeah, I think Colin would like. Yeah.
Oh, I just want to say I think it makes perfect ethical sense, but I think there's another layer, Rowland, with respect that Tarkovsky endlessly undermines our own attempts to conceptualize these films along ethical lines or psychological lines. Same at the end of Stalker. Again, it would have been a satisfactory ending if we ended with the wife's revelation of her unconditional love for this pitiful fool, as she refers to him. Likewise, the chance for Chris to go home and mend, in a sense, or pick up his relationship with his father would be great. But actually, I'm not sure we're allowed to settle quite in that way in these films, and that's what makes them sort of endlessly fascinating. That's what I'd want to say. I'm not sure that they're going to fit what we want to say as easily as we would like them to. I noticed a couple of hands up, Razvan, so I'll...
Yes, I see Martin has a...
I think Lioness did too.
Yes.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Oh, great, okay. So I'd like to thank both the speakers very much for their excellent and really stimulating papers. In fact, the question that Rowley raised was something that I wanted to question him about in his presentation a few weeks ago, because it seems to me that it clearly the final scene bears all of the signatures of the work of the ocean.
I agree.
So in a sense, you know, the fact that reality is a bit wrong is an echo of the fake lacing on the back of Harry's dress in her first appearance. It's one of the, I'm not sure touching is the right word, but there are many touching things about this film, but one of the touching things is it gets these slight details wrong, and yet somehow it creates something in Harry that Chris is capable of falling in love with. So the only way in which I mean, I saw this when I was very young, first time on a tiny black and white TV, and I think my youthful initial interpretation was that Tarkovsky was saying that we're all in Solaris, that Solaris is God or something like that. But I think that's a reach too far, really. And if we take seriously that this is the kind of logic of the narrative of the film, that the ocean can work in this way, whatever kind of entity it is, then semiotically, clearly the signatures of the mistakes that the ocean can make when it recreates things are there in that final scene. So if we're not going to say we're all in Solaris, which I think is a bit too far, then clearly he is still being, maybe he even has already died and he is a creation at that point. He's living in that, for want of a better term, virtual reality. That's the only thing that makes sense to me. I can't agree with you, Rowley, that he's really returned to Earth, except unless we're a kind of game of mirrors in which all reality that any one of us experiences is, in a sense, a copy, a simulacrum in the Platonic sense.
Well, actually, when I'm discussing this with students, I tend to shift to a position where, in some way, it doesn't matter whether he has returned to Earth or not, because in the way that you're suggesting that all human relationships are sort of played out within this larger thing, which could be called the love of God, or not, you know. I mean, but to me, it suggests a kind of vast ocean of love within which everything else is played out, and you know, whether he's gone back to Earth literally or not, in the last analysis, perhaps doesn't matter. So I'm actually closer to you than my initial statement suggested.
I mean, when you were talking, I was thinking, I was playing it all through in my head, and the trouble is that there are no in the beautiful opening sequence of the film, where we kind of take it, we see nature, which is then sort of played against the sort of arid sterility, where they try and ape nature with the bits of paper tied into the ventilator, which is just gorgeous. There are no signatures of Solaris in the opening. So you really do. It seems to me that the logic of the film is he is on Earth in the beginning, and he can't be on Earth at the end, because the trick, you know, he plays that really good trick. You think it's Earth, you think it's a return, and then the rain is falling. And then you get that final pan back to reveal the whole thing is an island in the ocean. And so I can't, that's exactly, you think that Harry is a real person when you first see her. And then very quickly, there are quite chilling things. I mean, if you just imagine how to put yourself in the kind of reality of the film, how Chris feels when he sees his wife, but there are these fake, you know, he can't undo, it's got things wrong. And that she's, you know, it must be horrific. Absolutely, you know, the sweat on him is really telling when you watch it over and over again, as I have done, because I've shown this clip to students in lectures quite a lot, and it always gets me even more every time I see it. And the amazing thing about it is that as it goes on, which you alluded to, Christoph, as he becomes more certain that it's not her, he falls in love with her. And she becomes more real, she becomes more anxious that she's not her. So you've got this inverse passage, which is just, you know, in the way that in so many relationships we come closer together, but we get further apart, and it causes all kinds of problems and rifts. It's an amazing love story in a way, which is probably what Lem hated about it, is that Tarkovsky turned it into a fantastic metaphysical love story, rather than, but it uses the science element in a really poetic, moving way, I think, in order to actually push the force of our, as you were saying, Rowley, of our reality.
I saw both Colin and Christoph willing to respond to that. So perhaps if we start with Colin.
Well, no, Christoph, you go ahead. I don't want to. I don't. It's you, Christoph. You speak to that.
Well, regarding the question about his trip, I think the question is rather whether he has actually left, not whether he returns. Because it's quite clear, you know, when he returns, the fire is still burning or smoldering. And also there are some other elements. The weather balloon is ascending and so on. So I would read it the other way around. The question, has the journey taken place in space and time? You know, but to say that he hasn't returned, from my perspective, doesn't make sense.
In that case, he wasn't where we thought he was in the first place.
Yeah, okay.
I think
rather, yeah.
I think it's worth reflecting on the fact that Tarkovsky chooses. You've got it that the story includes, remember, the narrative includes a trip presumably of millions and millions of miles from Earth to another planet. The trip seems to, it's a bit like Stalker. The return from the zone takes place just within one cut, and they're back in the bar. Chris, when he's on his way to Solaris, doesn't seem to have noticed that he's even taken off. He asks a question, I can't remember quite what it is, presumably of ground control. When are we setting off? And they say, oh, well, you're already on your way. And then he's pretty much there. Cut, and we're there. The journey that Tarkovsky concentrates on a great deal is Burton's trip back home after spending time at Chris's father's dacha, where we have 4.5 something minutes of traffic jams and a car journey outside Tokyo or something. And I think there's a point to that the journeys of the characters, the distance, the geography is not of a great deal of interest. I think it's not psychological. I think that's where I might take issue slightly with you, Christoph. I don't think this can be explained in terms of Freudian or Lacanian psychology. I think there's something here that is genuinely metaphysical. That's why I think I fuss about Neoplatonism, or I really respond to Martin's point about this is or was it Rowley's point about God, that the ocean of Solaris is the love of God? Those sorts of questions, I think, are bigger in my mind than the psychology or the distances travelled. I think it's important that Burton, we're with him in the car for pretty much the whole journey.
Christoph?
No, but that's what I was trying to reject. Any kind of psychological reduction.
Okay, sorry, Christoph. Yeah,
that's the point. I was talking about Harry's eschatological existence.
Yeah.
You see, I was using psychology at the end to understand the relationship between Harry and Chris, but I would never accept all the presuppositions underlying psychoanalysis, Lacanian psychoanalysis.
Sure. Yeah, no.
Harry is real in the eschatological sense, because everything else doesn't make sense. But at the same time, she's a neutrino assembly because it's science fiction. That's the way she's present on the space station. And all the psychological element is important too. Because of course, she reappears, she's dead, and Chris feels guilty when she appears. That's absolutely clear. So there are psychological processes that are extremely complex, and psychology can help us to understand. But what I was trying to reject, any kind of reduction, as well as scientific reductionism. But at the same time, I try to not to construct a kind of dichotomy between science, psychology, and theology, because I think the scientific and the psychological kind of integrated in the theological perspective, and that's why I was talking about the eschatological identity of Harry that embraces the two aspects. That was my idea.
I understand that, and I accept it entirely. And I think Martin made a very good point. I think that the more real she becomes, in a sense, the more she opens her, the more she finds herself open to question. There's a sort of Heideggerian Dasein quality that comes into play, which I think is a mark. Heidegger would say this, certainly. It's a mark of human existence, that we are beings who can call our own being into question. And she starts to be able to do that when she comes round from the second suicide attempt after the nitrogen drinking, or whatever it is, the liquid nitrogen. She says, "Who am I? Who am I?" Not where am I, or where is this place, or even who are you, but who am I? And that's an incredibly human moment. I think she's absolutely real. That's not a psychological moment. I think that's a metaphysical moment. And I completely agree with you there, Christoph. Yeah.
Okay, well, dear friends, we've gone quite a bit over the time, but there may have been a question from Elizabeth, our friend. I saw a raised hand at one point from Lioness. So Elizabeth, do you have a question?
Yes, I'm at a bit of a disadvantage not having seen either of the films. Perhaps I should see them sometime. But I was very interested in what Christoph was describing, this development of a relationship with a spouse who's dead. And I wonder if either of the speakers is... Oh, let me start the video. Familiar with Charles Williams' All Hallows Eve, which in a totally non-science fiction setting, but a similar theme of a dead wife, and in some sense, having unfinished business with her husband. Are either of you familiar with that story? And do you see any parallels, contrasts?
I'd have to say I'm not familiar with it. No, sorry, Elizabeth. I'm not familiar with it. Is it what is it? Is it a poem or
Charles Williams? It's a novel, All Hallows Eve.
Right. No, I'm not familiar with it, I'm afraid.
I can't answer this question either, Elizabeth. No. Sorry.
No, I don't think there's time to.
Maybe someone else can.
If not, that seems like a pleasant homework for us all.
I'll check it. I'll check. Thank you, Elizabeth. I'll check it out. It sounds very good.